So I want to start. Remember I said we'd go back to thyroid. Damn it. I need to start wearing consistent clothes that I remember how to hook it up. This mic. All right. So this whole thing is called a follicle. These are the follicular cells that make thyroid hormone. This is a colloid where they're stored. So what happens is these follicular cells, they import iodine. They spend a lot of energy actually importing iodine. And then they throw it into the colloid. Meanwhile, these follicular cells are making proteins, TG. That's not triglycerides, that's thyroglobulin. They put those proteins into the colloid, and when thyroid stimulating hormone binds, it mobilizes these proteins back into the cell. And remember, these proteins are made up of a bunch of tyrosine molecules, tyrosine amino acids. So here's a tyrosine, here's the whole protein in red. Colloid puts the iodine on those proteins, binds them together. When they go through the pathway of secretion, proteases within the cell cut those tyrosines off, and thyroid hormone gets secreted. All right? I think the recent number I read was each thyroglobulin molecule, protein, has about 70 tyrosine molecules. So you can produce about 35 thyroid hormones per thyroglobulin. Okay? So that's kind of the pathway that it goes through. So I know I didn't cover that clearly last time. Hopefully that makes a little more sense. All right, and then we ended here, right? What thyroid hormone does. In other words, if you don't have thyroid hormone and you do have thyroid hormone, you would really expect what to happen? Opposite things, right? So realize that if you have low thyroid hormones, low T3, T4, these are going to be the consequences, and they're going to be just the opposite of these. So I'm going to talk about what happens with thyroid hormones. And so without, you guys should just extrapolate. Thyroid hormones, what do they do? What's their main function? If you had to just give one sentence to it. Metabolism, increased metabolic rate. So what do you need to increase metabolic rate? You need more energy, right? So you're going to increase gluconeogenesis, new glucose molecules from non-glucose precursors. So fats and proteins get converted to energy. Glycogenolysis, taking down all the glycogen that's stored in your liver and muscles, converting that to glucose. And increased glycolysis, so you're going to make precursors to go into the citric acid cycle and electron transport chain. All right, so that's going to increase your glucose, right? Because what do cells need for energy? Glucose. Increase protein metabolism, because what are you going to do with all this energy? You're going to build proteins, you're going to do things. You're going to increase synthesis, but you're also going to increase proteolysis, so which is kind of weird. You're increasing the synthesis of proteins that are needed for these metabolic things, but you're also going to increase the breakdown of proteins, all right, which leads to muscle wasting. Why are we breaking down proteins? I'll give you a hint. I already told you. Gluconeogenesis. Right? They're getting converted to energy. All right? So you're breaking up proteins that aren't needed for this thyroid action, but building up proteins that are needed for T3, T4 action, but breaking down all other proteins. All right? Increase in lipolysis, because where does most of your energy come from? Fats. All right? And you're going to see a decrease in serum cholesterol. This is kind of weird. We don't use cholesterol for energy. It just doesn't happen. But thyroid hormones are necessary for cholesterol clearance. So if you have an increase in thyroid hormones, you're going to have an increase in cholesterol clearance out of your body. So that's why cholesterol goes down. Okay? So if you don't have thyroid hormones, you have an increase in cholesterol because you're not clearing it as efficiently. All right, so that's the backward one of that. And what does thermogenesis mean? Heat production. So if you increase the basal metabolic rate, if you turn on your car, it's going to get hot. Okay? I was going to make a Nick joke, but anyway. All right. So, what would you expect to happen if you are increasing the basal metabolic rate of your cells? Well, you're producing more heat, you're producing more energy, so you're going to need to increase oxygenation. You're going to need to increase waste removal from tissue, so you're going to have to increase everything cardiovascular. Heart rate's going to increase. Heart rate's going to increase. Stroke volume's going to increase. Therefore, cardiac output's going to increase. So therefore, blood pressure is also going to increase as a result. Short term. All right. Respirations are going to increase. If you are using more energy, you're going to need more oxygen to help with that process. So you're going to increase respirations, increase GI motility. All right. Diarrhea is what that means. Increased CNS activity. In other words, you're going to be in kind of a vigilant, hypervigilant state. You're going to be anxious. All right. Slight increase in muscle strength because they're revved up, they're ready to go. In some cases, you'll have a decreased muscle strength simply because you develop tremors and they kind of wear themselves out. All right, so that's what that difference, increased muscle strength, decreased muscle strength means. Increased fatigue, but inability to sleep. If your body is constantly revved up, you're gonna blow through all of your energy reserves, right? But you can't sleep because you're revved up, so you never get to rest. So it's kind of this vicious cycle thing. And sexual function. Low T3, T4 leads to impotence in men, okay, and women. And in women specifically, menorrhagia and polymenorrhea. What does that mean?
Bleeding.
Too much bleeding. Right? All right, so these are some of the effects. Now, this is what's going on for too long, and they're pathologic. All right, most of these things, if you think about it, they're going to be pathologic because we all have T3, T4 secreted on a regular basis. It's doing things for our body. But we don't have these things going on, right? So this is what happens when you are having an increased levels of T3 and T4. So clinically, what are you going to see? All right, if you have somebody that's hyperthyroid versus somebody that's hypothyroid, all right, hyperthyroid makes sense. They're already going to be revved up. They're already going to be producing a lot of heat. So if it gets hotter, how are they going to feel? Ugh. Like they're not going to be very tolerant to heat. Bulging eyes. You guys ever seen those pictures, exophthalmos, where the people with hyperthyroid have the eyes bulging? It's because you've increased you've hypertrophied the tissue behind the eyes, and it's pushing them out, like the connective tissue and the fat tissue. Of course, tachycardia. We know that increase in systolic blood pressure if it's going on long enough. Tremors we talked about. Fatigue. Weight loss. If you're in a hyperrev state, you're going to have weight loss. Not a good, weight loss plan because of all these other things that are going on, but you'll have weight loss. So that's what you see with hyperthyroid. With hypothyroid, just the opposite, right? Your body is not revved up. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing metabolically. So everything's going to slow down. If everything slows down, you're going to be cold all the time and very intolerant to cold. You're going to gain weight. You're going to be very couch potato, pretty much. You're not going to want to get up. You don't have the energy to get up. Low heart rate. We talked about weight gain. Extreme fatigue. extreme fatigue because you can't get your cells into gear, right? That's different from the fatigue you're experiencing from hyperthyroidism because you're burning through all your energy. This is because you just can't, you're sluggish constantly, okay? So think of the Tasmanian devil versus that sloth from Zootopia.
On 2 slides ago, it said there's no change in mean pressure, but then on the hyper, mean pressure unchanged. But then on that one with hyper, it said increased systolic only.
Here?
Yeah, under tachy, it says increased.
Increased systolic blood pressure. Okay. Yeah, so your mean pressure, which is a function of both systolic and diastolic, is going to be unchanged because the diastolic will compensate for the systolic.
I just wanted to make sure since it only said systolic.
But systolic because you are increasing specifically stroke volume as well. Good question. All right, so that's thyroid. Now we'll move on to parathyroid. All right, which is weird. I need to change the order of these slides. Parathyroid hormone, PTH. Again, where is it produced? Parathyroid glands. Where are those located? You saw them in the little models.
Little dots on the back.
Pardon?
Dots on the back.
Those little black dots on the back of the thyroid up in a lab that you guys aren't going to be in anymore. So 4 little areas, they're not like really dots, they're like areas of tissue that are different from the surrounding tissue of the thyroid. Where do they act? Kidneys, bone, and digestive tract. Add that to it. They are a peptide hormone, which means they're water soluble and therefore steroid or non-steroid? Non-steroid. All right. What does parathyroid hormone do? It increases blood calcium, specifically. All right, and we've covered this already. Primarily, where does that calcium come from? Bones. Because you're activating osteoclasts. Good. So we parathyroid hormone is an increase in plasma calcium. In the kidneys, what parathyroid hormone does is it increases the production of D3, vitamin D. And what's vitamin D3 important for the absorption of? Calcium. So this is how it has the effect in your gut, right? It increases calcium absorption in the gut through the production of vitamin D. Increases osteoclast activity, therefore increase bone resorption. Calcium goes out into the blood, increases. It inhibits calcium excretion from the kidney. So in other words, the glomerulus filters all the calcium, and it doesn't end up in the urine. So what has to have happened as far as kidney function goes? If it's filtered but doesn't appear in the urine, then it's getting reabsorbed. Good. All right. But parathyroid hormone increases calcium, but it decreases phosphate. All right. The reason why you have this going on is if you have both an increase in calcium and an increase in phosphate, they're going to ionically bind together and form a precipitate. Do you want a precipitate forming in your blood? No. So you need to keep phosphate concentrations low when calcium concentrations are increasing. All right. So what this little graph shows you is that when you inject parathyroid hormone, calcium levels go up, phosphate levels go down. All right, because we want to avoid bad chemistry. All right, opposite, calcitonin. Calcitonin, if parathyroid increases blood calcium, calcitonin decreases blood calcium. plasma calcium. All right. God? Oh, my email's open. All right, calcitonin in the thyroid. Remember, these, you have the follicular cells, colloid, these whole things are follicles. They produce T3, T4. But these C cells that are outside the follicles produce calcitonin. So it kind of makes sense. All the hormones that produce calcitonin, I'm sorry, regulate calcium are kind of in the same place, right? Thyroid, parathyroid, same general area. All right, where does calcitonin act? Primarily the bone. All right, so it's going to cause osteoblasts to put more calcium into the bone, therefore you're taking it from the blood. If you are activating osteoblasts, is it just activating, or are you going to have to produce more of them too? Guesses? You're going to have to produce, so you're going to cause cell division of osteoblasts as well. Same thing happens with PTH and osteoclasts. All right, calcitonin, also a peptide hormone, therefore it is water-soluble and a non-steroid. All right, opposite effects of PTH, decreases blood calcium. Again, osteoblasts, putting bone back, or calcium back into bone. All right, here's what we didn't cover with parathyroid hormone, but we're going to kind of mention it here. What's the stimulus to release parathyroid hormone? Because you always have to think of what your hormone does, therefore what's going to cause it to be released. If your hormone, PTH, increases blood calcium, what's going to be the stimulus to release parathyroid hormone? A decrease in calcium, right? So if your calcitonin is designed to decrease blood calcium, then the stimulus for its release is increase in blood calcium, okay? So whatever the effect is, the stimulus is going to be just the opposite. Because if we already had an increase in blood calcium and that stimulated parathyroid hormone release, what kind of feedback would that be? Positive feedback. You know, then we have no way to shut it off. All right? And if we had too much calcium, we're going to end up like stone pillars, right? All right. All right, we talked about all this, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. This is your summary slide of all of that. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this as far as the content because we've already talked about it. But I have this thing in green down here that says if you want to increase calcium, these are where it's going to happen. So bone, kidneys, gut. All right. Excuse me. If you have parathyroid disorders, again, you have to consider what's happening if it's too high, what's happening if it's too low. Without looking, if you have too much parathyroid hormone, what's your calcium going to be like? Too high. If you have too little parathyroid hormone, your calcium is going to be too low. Okay? So, hyperparathyroidism, because you're activating osteoclasts, and those are the ones responsible for breaking down bone and putting calcium in the blood, you're going to constantly be degrading bone. So you're going to have a decrease in bone mass. So what's that going to put you at more of a risk for? Fractures, breaks, if they happen often enough and don't get repaired properly, deformities. You're going to hyperpolarize excitable membranes. So in other words, where did I put my markers? if our resting membrane potential of the nervous system sits at about minus 70 millivolts, and we have more calcium that makes no sense.
It's more positive outside. So the inside's not any more negative, the outside's even more positive. So it'd still be
Yeah, you're right. Wow. Yeah. All right. So think of the membrane here. Minus 70 is what it's like on the inside. And so that's a balance between positive and negative ions. If I put more positive ions on the outside, that's going to make the difference between these two greater, therefore hyperpolarize. If my threshold potential is minus 55, it's going to take me much longer to get there from a hyperpolarized state than it is from a normal resting membrane potential, and therefore we're going to have our muscles aren't going to respond as quickly, right? Because they're hyperpolarized. It takes a much bigger stimulus to get them to send an action potential. All right. Also, calcium deposition in organs. You're probably going to be more susceptible to gallstones, cholesterol-based gallstones, probably more susceptible to kidney stones. All right. If you're hypoparathyroid, just the opposite. You would actually take your resting membrane potential from minus 70 and make it like minus 60, right? If you are sitting really close to threshold, what's going to happen? Even the slightest depolarization is going to make you go bzzz. Okay. Think of how you guys are right now, right? Think about it this way. You guys are stressed. You guys are like, here's like, I'm going to go fucking ape shit, and here's where you guys are sitting right here. Okay? So it only takes a little bit more to get you to go. So your family calls, and you're like, oh my God, I'm having such a hard time. I can't fucking talk to you right now. I got to study for every exam right now. Okay. So that's my example of what happens when you have a reduced hypothyroidism, reduction in membrane polarization, okay? Over responsiveness. All right, so how's that going to manifest with your nervous system? If you're overly responsive, spasms, convulsions, cramping. All right, you're going to get more cramps. If gone on long enough and severe enough, paralysis. Okay, so can be a problem. What don't you see here? What's one important thing we talked about this semester that heavily relies on calcium? Okay, heart. That's one. I was thinking of something else. It's related to heart. Same. Area. Blood. Clotting. Right? You need calcium for blood clotting. That's not on here because the levels at which you are, well, two things. One, no, just one thing. The levels at which you are changing are not enough to affect blood clotting. The sources of calcium can come from other areas, can come from other things. And we'll talk about that, I think, spring semester when we talk about clotting disorders. So clotting's not really affected by this, even though you think, oh, it might be. No. All right, adrenal glands. One of the things I hate about hormones and endocrine system is that it seems like, all right, here's a gland, here are the hormones, here's a gland, here, and you don't get to really talk about them in a whole lot of detail. And it sounds like this is a survey of everything, and it's kind of boring. I'm bored right now. You guys are like, me too. Adrenal glands. Where are they located? Top of the kidneys. Adrenal. What's another name for them? Suprarenal. That shows that they're on top of the kidneys. So these little pyramid-shaped organs on top of the kidneys. They have a very specific structure. You have the adrenal cortex, which is where that line is, and then the adrenal medulla sitting in the middle. All right, the cortex is divided into 3 discrete layers. Each one of those layers will secrete a different hormone. All right, and when we're talking about the adrenal cortex and the hormones that are secreted from it, what kind of hormones are secreted by the cortex? Steroids. All right, you need to know that. I'm not saying you need to know that because I'm necessarily going to, like, every question. You guys already got the how to study for the exam. But if you know that adrenal gland is where your steroids are coming from, everything else has to be non-steroid. Make it easy for yourselves. All right, starting with the adrenal medulla, because that's the odd one. Adrenal medulla produces catecholamines. All right, again, they're based on the amino acid tyrosine. The catechol part is the ring. The amine part is the amino acid containing nitrogen. All right, that's why they're called catecholamines again. The two ones that are secreted from the two catecholamines, the two catecholamines secreted from the medulla are norepinephrine and epinephrine. We've already talked a lot about norepinephrine throughout the semester because it is also not just a hormone but a neurotransmitter, right? Epinephrine is very similar in structure to norepinephrine. Both can also act as hormones, and the effects are very similar to what you would see with the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so both of these will be involved in what response? Fight or flight. Good, thank you. All right. Actually, it makes sense that norepinephrine and epinephrine would be neurotransmitters and hormones because the cells within the adrenal medulla are modified sympathetic neurons, right? So they would, again, secrete. It'd be almost like neurosecretion. All right. Most of what gets released is epinephrine, not norepinephrine. All right. So that's why we tend to focus on back up. What's another name for adrenaline? Yeah. Shit. Adrenaline and noradrenaline are the other names for them. Okay. That's why we focus on adrenaline, epinephrine, because it is the most abundant one. All right. The goal of these is to help the body deal with stress. Okay, so if you're in a stressful situation where you need to fight or flight, again, you want to ramp everything up. You're not increasing the metabolic rate of cells, but you are increasing certain things to give you more energy to deal with a stressful situation. All right, moving to the adrenal cortex. So we're not going to go into any more about that because we've already talked a lot about the fight or flight in previous topics. But the adrenal cortex, again, steroid hormones. You have 3 layers from the outside to the in. This is outside, so this would be right here. 1, 2, 3. The outside is the zona glomerulosa. Again, words matter, so where do you find glomeruli? Seriously? Which is where? Kidneys. All right, so you find glomerulus in the kidneys. So the hormones from here affect the kidneys. What hormone affects the kidneys? Aldosterone. All right, that's a mineralocorticoid. What do mineralocorticoids act on? Minerals. What's an example of a mineral? Sodium. All right, so that comes from the zona glomerulosa. The zona fasciculata, it's called fasciculata because they look like columns. Fascicles are like columns. That's what secretes our cortisol. All right, primarily cortisol. The other ones in red are just variations of cortisol plus some androgens. And then the zona reticularis, the innermost layer, is going to secrete your androgens, the primary secretion of your androgens that are not coming from the gonads. All right, all of which are steroid hormones. Based on what molecule? Cholesterol. Good. All right. We'll start with aldosterone. What stimulates aldosterone secretion? All right, we know that aldosterone is geared towards increasing sodium in our blood. So, what's going to cause an increase in aldosterone secretion? Decreases in sodium. All right, and that is linked to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which we covered in the renal system, which is, again, reminded right here. So I'm not going to go through the whole RAS system, but there's a summary reminder right there. But even more strongly than that, aldosterone secretion is stimulated by an increase in potassium levels. Now, why is that? Even though aldosterone primarily works on reabsorbing sodium, which we talked about, why is potassium a stimulus for secretion? You guys remember? In the renal tubular cells, what does aldosterone actually produce? Remember, it's a steroid hormone, so it's going to produce more proteins. What's the specific protein that it produces that allows you to reabsorb sodium? Do you remember? What did you say? No. No. Sodium potassium pumps. Right? That's what aldosterone does, is it puts more sodium potassium pumps in the renal tubular cells. So when you do that, you're pumping sodium towards the reabsorption pathway, but you're putting potassium towards the secretion pathway. So this is a way of getting rid of excess potassium when levels are too high. Why would potassium be a more important stimulus for secretion than low sodium levels? I know it's Friday. I know it's your last day. I know you're stressed about your pharm exam. Is too much potassium good for you? What does it do? Arrhythmias in the heart, right? It could actually kill you. Too high potassium could kill you. In fact, that's the whole basis for the lethal injection is potassium chloride. So we want to avoid too much potassium. So your body's like, too much potassium. Normal concentrations potassium, 3.5 to 5. All right? Very small, very narrow range. And it needs to be regulated very tightly. Aldosterone helps do that. All right, so when it's secreted, we know where it's secreted from. We know what it targets. This is a not well put together slide like you've seen before. Where it acts on the kidney, collecting duct, distal convoluted tubule to reabsorb sodium, excrete potassium. We just talked about that by putting sodium potassium pumps on the renal tubular cell membrane. All right, just for clearing up, I'm not going to ask you, but I care that you know this, okay, sodium potassium pumps. It also will help put more sodium channels and potassium channels on the other side of the membrane to help with the reabsorption and secretion of these electrolytes. So it's not just the pump, it's other channels as well, but the pump is the main driver. All right, aldosterone is a steroid. It doesn't dissolve in blood very well, so we have to transport it with binding proteins, plasma binding, or proteins. We have to bind it to proteins, albumin, prealbumin, to help transport it. Okay, this is just another summary slide of what we've talked about. Increased potassium will increase aldosterone. We talked about why. Increase in RAS. What is RAS? Renin-angiotensin system will increase aldosterone. That's why we also call it RAAS, renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. An increase in extracellular fluid volume will decrease aldosterone because when you reabsorb sodium, what also are you reabsorbing? Water. So if you already have enough water, you don't want to reabsorb sodium and make it more. Okay, so that's why aldosterone secretion will be decreased when you have a high fluid volume. All right, ACTH. Do you remember what that is? Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it targets the cortex of the adrenal and causes secretion of other hormones. Primarily, it works on cortisol, but it also is needed for aldosterone secretion. All right, so you have to have ACTH present for aldosterone secretion, but adding more of it does not increase the rate of aldosterone secretion. Potassium and the renin-angiotensin system do increase the rate. All right, so what happens if we have aldosterone disorders? All right, hypo. Too much aldosterone means we have too much sodium. Therefore, we have too much water. All right, so what's going to do to our blood volume? Increase it. What's it going to do to our blood pressure? Increase it. Okay. On the flip side, we're getting rid of too much potassium. All right, so that could put us into a hypokalemic state below that 3.5, and therefore we are, again, at risk for arrhythmias. All right, the arrhythmias associated with hypokalemia are not as severe as that with hyperkalemia, but still a problem. If we have too little aldosterone, we're not reabsorbing enough sodium, therefore we're not reabsorbing enough water, plasma volume decreases. So what's going to happen to blood pressure? Decrease. What's going to happen to perfusion of organs? Decrease. All right, so we may not have enough to perfuse our organs adequately. That also puts us at risk for hyperkalemia, and we know the problems with that. All right, zona fasciculata secretes cortisol. All right, cortisol is what we know as our stress hormone. If we were to test everybody in here right now, what are there, 25 of you? 23 of you would have high cortisol levels. There might be 2 of you that are sitting in here like, fuck it. All right, cortisol will target most of the cells of your body, bone, muscle, brain, things like that. It's called a glucocorticoid. Remember, aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid, which tells you what it acts on. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid, which tells you it acts on blood glucose. Specifically, if it's a stress hormone and its goal is to help you deal with stressful situations, what do you need to deal with stressful situations? Energy. Where does that come from? Glucose. So it's going to increase blood glucose levels to give you the more energy to deal with a stressful situation. At too high of levels. So once you guys, and this actually happens to me after semesters too. I get stressed, my cortisol levels are like through the roof. Stress stops, cortisol levels go down. I get sick a lot right after the end of the semester because cortisol suppresses your immune system, so you're more susceptible to infections. All right, why does it happen after the semester? Why doesn't it happen during the semester?
Everything's ramped up during.
because everything's also ramped up. So even if I am getting sick, I'm not feeling as much, but as soon as my epinephrine, norepinephrine go down, cortisol level, it's a steroid, lasts longer period of time. So my immune system, despite the fact that my energy levels are dropping now, is still suppressed. So I get sick and I'm like, damn it. All right. Again, you guys have seen this before. Cortisol goes right through the cell membrane, binds to its receptor, goes to the nucleus, acts as a transcription factor, produces more proteins to give you a cellular response. At least an hour before it starts having an effect. So, never mind. That doesn't make sense. So, it takes a long time to have an effect, but the effects last much longer. Again, because you're producing new proteins. New proteins are going to stick around for quite a bit. Therefore, it's going to last longer. All right? What does it do? Well, it's going to increase, here's your summary of what it does. Increase glucose, increase free fatty acids, increase amino acids. So, you're going to turn proteins and fat into glucose. So you're going to break down proteins. You're going to convert all your glycogen in muscle and liver to glucose. And you're going to increase your free fatty acids for energy as well. All right? What does cortisol do? How does it suppress the immune system? Well, it actually does a couple things. It's one of the things that it really has an effect on is your inflammation cascade. All right, so if you get wounded, for example, in a high period of stress, that wound won't heal as quickly because inflammation is reduced. So what cortisol does is it blocks the release of those chemicals that cause inflammation, those chemicals that cause vasodilation, those chemicals that increase capillary permeability, that allow more blood to flow to the tissue area. All right? That's what cortisol blocks. Okay, so you see it blocking here, those chemicals. It directly blocks capillary permeability, so not just the chemicals that increase capillary permeability, but something within the endothelial cells itself gets blocked. Blocks the clotting, because remember, clotting goes around the area of inflammation, kind of walls it off from everything else so it's contained. And cortisol prevents white blood cells from coming in, primarily neutrophils. So if you can't destroy what's causing an infection, it's harder to heal that tissue. All right? Therefore, it takes longer to heal. It doesn't heal by primary intention, and you have scars forming. All right? You're more likely to form scars. Cortisol also reduces the fever response, reduces the T cell response, reduces allergic reactions. I love peanuts, and I'm going to eat them when I'm really stressed out, even though I'm allergic to them. Just kidding, not a good idea. Will also increase red blood cells formation. Okay, energy. All right. Again, you have talked about this before. CRH from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary, cortisol from the adrenal cortex. All right? That's the way it works. Then cortisol, this is the way it's supposed to work. It can go back and shut off ACTH, and it can go back and shut off corticotropin-releasing hormone. Classic negative feedback pathway. All right? Typical stimuli for the release of cortisol is that list that you see on the right. All right? Every single one of those, except for probably disease and sympathetic activation, are completely temporary. Cortisol is designed to be a short-term as in like days, response. So when you have too much cortisol secreted for too long of a period, then you run into real problems, okay? So you're supposed to have cortisol release. It does help you deal with these responses. But if that stress goes on too long, then you run into problems. All right, this is just showing you the negative feedback pathway again, different view. This is showing you our general adaptation syndrome. Because we live in a society where we don't have to deal with the stresses that our ancestors had to deal with, like bears chasing us in the woods and shit like that, all of our stresses come from psychological things that we impose upon ourselves, like, PA school. So, what happens with PA school? Let's give examples. That you wake up at 7:45 and your exam's at 8 o'clock, right? Yanni's planning for it. She's like, I'm going to test this. All right, that's called the alarm stage. In the alarm stage, that's going to increase sympathetic discharge. That's going to increase epinephrine and norepinephrine. All of those are dedicated to dealing with that short-term response. Oh my God, I got to run really fast, get my clothes on, eat something quick, run out the door, drive really fast, hope not to get pulled over by a cop, and make it to school and get in and take my test. Whew, you're ramped up, right? So that's our short-term fight or flight response. If you check your blood pressure, if you check your temperature, if you check your heart rate, everything is going to be increased. At the same time, cortisol is released, which allows you to deal with, so you burn up a lot of energy really quick with that alarm stage. Cortisol will help you maintain glucose levels because you burn through everything while you come down, right? So it still helps you deal with that stress response by helping you get back to an even keel stage. But if that stress is ongoing, like, oh my God, you realize halfway through your test, I have a paper due in the class right after this. And then I have another exam tomorrow, and then next week we have our anatomy midterm. Right? That's longer term. So you're going to have a much longer increase in cortisol in your blood, which is going to put you into what we call the resistant stage, okay, or long-term adjustment stage. So increase in concentration of amino acids, glucose to give you that energy, all right? And then if this goes on long enough, then you get into the exhaustion stage where you're burning through all of these energy reserves so quickly, your body can't keep up with production, all right? And you get exhausted. You just collapse, all right? So that's the response to stress, general adaptation syndrome. And then the semester's over, and you sit at the bar, and you have a beer or 9. And you're like, that wasn't that bad. Next semester will be great. And then the first day, Yanni wakes up at 7:45, and class starts at 8. All right. Why don't we take a quick break, and then we'll come back to it. All right. So we'll finish. We've got 20 more slides. 20, 18. More slides. The last thing we're going to talk about is insulin and blood glucose regulation. Out of everything, I don't even know how much of the test is dedicated to it, but out of everything we cover, the most common thing you're going to come in contact with are people with diabetes mellitus. All right, so it's important to understand how that works. All right, with cortisol disorders, you either have too much or too little secretion. And usually too much secretion is related to tumors, particularly tumors in the anterior pituitary. All right. Again, it's a glucocorticoid, so it's going to increase glucose levels. So you're going to have hyperglycemia. You're going to end up having very specific, and I don't know the reason why, very specific fat deposition on the face. So you get like this moon, what they call a moon face appearance. Think of, I was like, what do you mean moon face? Think of orangutans. You know how they have the hair and then they have that big moon face like this? That's, to me, it's hard to picture, so I have to come up with examples that make sense to me. And they have, and on the back, right here, so we call that the buffalo hump. So fat deposition on their back. So if you see a patient that has a really round face and is kind of hunched over with a hump on their back, you're like, we probably got an endocrine problem. Refer to endocrinologist. I don't want to deal with you. Goodbye. Goodbye. All right, of course, weight gain, hair loss, problems, chronic problems with infections because too much cortisol, your immune system's compromised. All right, Addison's disease is just the opposite. It's not as common. In fact, it's very rare that people have this problem. Again, just the opposite. Low blood sugar because ACTH, because it could be a problem with ACTH, can affect mineralocorticoids. You can have hyponatremia because you don't have enough. Remember, ACTH is responsible for aldosterone release. So if you don't have ACTH, if we don't have aldosterone release, you're not reabsorbing the sodium. That's driving the hyponatremia. Weakness. I know I put this lady on here because she gave a good example of the color change that you experience. It's not blue. It's this bronze color appearance. To some, it might appear like she has a nice tan. She's like, oh yeah, she probably lives in like Florida or something. No, people in Florida don't go outside. She lives in the Bahamas. Is that true? You go. All right.
Sometimes.
From what so I want to move to Florida at some point in my life, and people say, don't move to Florida because you'll just become one of these people like everybody else that just sits in your air conditioning all day and does nothing. Like, no, there's some pretty. So I'm not making fun of Florida people.
You should.
And weight loss. So just the opposite of what you see with Cushing's. Again, if you see a patient with Addison's disease, consider yourself to have a lucky opportunity to help treat them because it's not a common condition. You'll learn a lot. Finally, sex hormones. They are mostly secreted by the gonads, but there are androgens secreted from the zona reticularis. They get secreted, they go to peripheral tissues, they get converted to testosterone or estrogens depending on the type of receptors you have in those peripheral tissues. All right, but we're not going to say any more about that because I think we went through the whole gamut of sex hormones when we did reproductive. All right, the last thing we're talking about is the pancreas. All right, you know where it's located. You know what its digestive functions are. Those are all exocrine functions. We don't give a shit about exocrine functions now. We give a crit about endocrine functions. All right, those come from. Here's your pancreas. If we look at the microscopic level, most of these are pancreatic acinar cells that are going to secrete your digestive enzymes into tubes. Every so often, you'll have these little light stained islands of cells called islets of Langerhans. No, they're not islets. They're islets, little islands. That's what that means. Little islands of endocrine tissue that secrete hormones. All right? Different types of cells are in them. The predominant one is a beta cell. Beta cell, alpha cell, which secretes insulin. So the beta cells secrete insulin from those little islets of Langerhans. And that's the primary one we're going to focus on today. There is glucagon secreted by the alpha cells, and that will help increase blood glucose, but not too many people have problems with that relative to insulin problems. All right, so insulin is our primary hormone we're going to be talking about. Insulin produced in the beta cells of the pancreatic islets. Where does it act? Muscle, liver, fat, basically all cells of our body, most cells of our body. Its structure is a peptide, water-soluble, therefore it's non-steroid. Okay? Because it's non-steroid, it can freely dissolve into plasma. It's a peptide hormone, has a very specific structure to it. This is what the structure looks like. You don't have to know that, but realize that there is a part of this that can be, this is how insulin secreted. These two structures right here, this C peptide is cut off, and you can actually detect the presence of C peptide in the blood to give you an idea of how much insulin is being secreted too. So it does have some clinical relevance. Half-life, 6 minutes. The half-life of insulin is 6 minutes. So it has a very quick response. All right, so if its half-life is only 6 minutes, but it takes you 6 hours to digest a meal, what does that mean about insulin release during that time? Is it just, I detect a little bit of glucose and, or is it like more constant for a while? It's more constant for a while, okay, until glucose levels fall. All right. People forget this, or people don't want to pay attention to this, and I don't know why. All right. When we have high glucose, all right, normally speaking, every one of us at some point will have high glucose because we just did what? Ate something with carbohydrates in it. That's going to stimulate insulin release. All right, high glucose stimulates insulin release. So the beta cells in the pancreas will get a flow of increased blood glucose, and they'll say, hey, there's a lot of glucose. We need to start secreting more insulin to take care of this high glucose. All right, insulin will go into the blood. It will bind to peripheral receptors. Let's, for argument's sake, say muscle. In the muscle. No, let's not say muscle. Let's just say peripheral receptors. And it will cause glucose to go into those cells. If glucose is going into the cells, where's it coming from? The blood. All right? So if you put glucose from the blood into the cells, you are decreasing blood glucose. All right? That's the part that people forget. Like, it decreases blood glucose. Well, where does it go? I don't know. It goes into your cells because your cells need to use it as what? Fuel! Right? They need fuel. So, another way to say the function of insulin is to increase glucose uptake by cells. In fact, I would say, arguably, that's a more accurate description of what insulin does. But the general population is dumb and they don't understand that. All right, so when you have glucose being put into cells, all right, some of it's going to be used, but some of it has to be stored. So you're going to stimulate glycogen formation. Remember, glycogen is a bunch of glucose molecules linked up together. All right, so that's the storage form of glucose. It's going to stimulate fat cells to store fat. So you're going to turn certain amino acids, you're going to convert glucose into fat. All right? You're going to inhibit gluconeogenesis. So you're going to say, hey, we've got enough sugar, we've got enough food coming in. Excuse me. So we don't need to break down proteins and fat to make more of it. So we're going to inhibit that process. And we're going to take in more amino acids because if we have an energy surplus, we're going to use that to build things. Okay? So the end result, decrease in blood glucose because it's going into cells because the cells need energy. Really important to remember. This slide right here at the bottom, the brain is the only organ that does not need insulin to take in glucose. The brain is the only organ that does not need insulin to take in glucose. Glucose directly goes in there. Like it's set up so, because glucose is the main fuel for the brain. In fact, it doesn't use fats. It shouldn't use fats. It uses glucose. So you need to have it readily available to the brain. So insulin does not work in the brain. Okay? So, time course of how this works. And think about this once you get to your clin med classes and start thinking about different types of insulin and how they work. We increase muscle, liver, fat, glucose uptake. That takes seconds, right? Binds to receptor, bloop, put glucose receptor. Receptors on the surface, you take in glucose. Increase permeability, that to amino acids, that takes up through about 3 to 5 minutes. So you have to increase the amino acid receptors that are going to the surface. Change enzymes inside the cell, about 10 to 15 minutes. And alter transcription and translation, that takes hours to days. So you do actually alter some protein production pathways to help you build more proteins from amino acids, but that's like an hour-to-day response. So if I eat something right now, if I eat this, that looks really good actually, this jar of fruit here, and berries, they're all berries, this jar of berries, a couple days later, my cells are building things as a result from that particular energy. Okay. I don't know if I covered this yet, and if I'm going to cover it. I'll cover it on this slide. When there's a cell, let's call it a muscle cell, with an insulin receptor, when insulin binds, that will cause a cascade of events inside the cell that will take, I think it's GLUT1, it might be GLUT4, so don't quote me on it, a glucose transporter, and it will put those on the surface of the cell. All right, so insulin binding takes this pool of glucose receptors, glucose transporters, puts them on the surface of the cell, and that's what allows glucose to come in. All right, again, all of these are already made. They're sitting in storage inside the cells. Insulin just puts those storage containers out on the surface so that glucose can come in. Okay? That's how the signaling pathway works. All right? So what this slide shows you, here's your muscle, liver, fat. Remember, we're taking glucose into liver, we're taking glucose into fat, we're taking glucose into muscle, we're using it for energy in each one of those places, but we're also converting it into fat, converting it into glycogen, and converting it into amino acids to build proteins. Okay? Therefore, we are decreasing blood glucose. And because we're taking amino acids in, we're decreasing free fatty acids. Okay? Because we're putting fatty acids in here and fat as well, we are decreasing our keto acids. Okay, from fat breakdown. If we're not breaking down fat, but we're building fat instead, we're reducing our keto acids. And that's really important because if you don't have insulin working and you're burning fat instead of glucose, that increases keto acids, puts us into a ketoacidosis if we're diabetic. Was there a question? Okay, I'm seeing things. All right, so we know it's kind of weird. Insulin is regulated by glucose, but glucose is regulated by insulin, right? So, in order for insulin to be secreted, we have to have a change in glucose. That's what that's saying, all right? So if you look down here, this is our plasma glucose concentration, all right, from an experiment. This is our insulin secretion level. We don't actually start secreting insulin until our glucose levels reach about 95, 97 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. Actually, no, I take that back. Between 70 and 110. So, I don't know where that came from. If you go into the doctor's office and they check your glucose levels after fasting, like overnight, you didn't eat breakfast, you didn't drink anything, your glucose level should be between 70 and 110. All right? And at that level, you shouldn't be secreting insulin. All right, but after that level, notice that insulin secretion increases dramatically for even low increases in concentration of glucose. All right, and peak secretion occurs at about 500 milligrams per deciliter. All right, so if you reach 500 milligrams per deciliter and you're secreting a lot of insulin, what should you expect to see happening to glucose really quickly? Falling, okay? But if you go and test a patient and their glucose level fasting is like 400, what does that tell you? Insulin's not working, okay? Or insulin's not there. Oh, I had a whole slide. This was... Remember I drew it out in my shitty little picture? This is... Actually, no. This isn't it. Good Lord. It's the last day. All right. Do what? Vacation. All right. This is how insulin release is controlled. So this is kind of the opposite. If we have an increase in glucose, that's going to go into beta cells. Okay, that glucose is going to go into beta cells, start a signal transduction pathway that's going to result in insulin release. Okay, increase in blood glucose will get into these beta cells. I don't care that you know the actual pathway, but a signal transduction pathway that will promote the secretion of insulin. That's what this one is trying to show you. So, when we said here, insulin is regulated by glucose, this is what we mean. This increase in blood glucose goes into the cell, causes insulin release. So when glucose levels go down, you don't have as much coming in. Therefore, insulin is not stimulated to be released. All right, that's how glucose controls insulin release. All right, for the release of insulin, if we were to do an experiment and measure this over time after a meal, we would see that after blood glucose starts to rise, insulin's going to be released, and you're going to have a sharp spike. What that says is that all the insulin that's already stored in those cells gets released. Okay? Then it starts decreasing because, remember the half-life is 6 minutes, so you're going to start decreasing levels of insulin in your blood, and then it's going to start increasing. Why do you think it starts increasing again, but slower? Because now you're producing more insulin molecules, or insulin peptides. All right? So that's what we call a biphasic release. The first phase is related to all the insulin that's already in your beta cells gets released. And then the second release is all of the new insulin molecules that are being produced getting released. And that takes time. All right, so my shitty little picture was legitimate. The other hormone you have is glucagon. All right, glucagon, that still comes from pancreatic islet cells, but alpha cells instead of beta cells. Where does glucagon act? Primarily in the liver. Actually, in the liver is where the receptors for glucagon are located. All right? If insulin decreases blood glucose, then glucagon would increase blood glucose. So what's the stimulus for a glucagon release? Low glucose levels. Low glucose levels. And so glucagon doesn't stimulate you to eat, which is where we get a lot of our glucose, which is how we raise our blood glucose normally. So where does that extra glucose come from if you are acting on the liver? Who said it? What did you say? Glycogen. So you're going to start breaking down glycogen in the liver. Where else could glucose come from? Pardon? Be more specific. Why would we break down muscle? What specifically are we breaking down in muscle? Proteins to give us amino acids to convert to glucose. So glucagon is going to stimulate glycogenolysis, breakdown of glycogen, and gluconeogenesis, which is producing glucose from non-glucose precursors. Right? So that's what we just talked about. What's on this slide? It also stimulates triglycerides to break down into fatty acids and secrete those into circulation so they can be used as energy as well, or converted elsewhere to glucose. The end result, again, increase in blood glucose, which is just the opposite of what we saw with insulin. All right, the pancreas also secretes, you had the list earlier, but a third major hormone it secretes is somatostatin. And yes, this is the same somatostatin that is from the hypothalamus that stops growth hormone or inhibits growth hormone. All right? But it's secreted by the delta cells of the islets of Langerhans. And its job is to inhibit secretion of glucagon and inhibit secretion of insulin. So it stops both of them. And we're not going to go into any more details about it than that. I guess we are. Let's not. Skip. You guys like it when you get that go. I found this over the years. Students love it when they can go. It is like, shut up. Allison, you're grounded. All right. So, this shows you the negative feedback of insulin and glucagon. Let's work our way through this. I eat a meal. I have a spike in blood glucose. What's going to happen? You need to speak louder. Insulin release from where? Beta cells in the pancreatic islets. All right? Insulin goes out. Where does insulin go to? All cells of the body. What does it do to all cells of the body? Puts glucose transporters on cells. Glucose goes into cells. What happens to blood glucose? Decreases. That goes back to that decrease in blood glucose will then go back to the pancreatic islets and do what? Shut off insulin release. That's negative feedback. All right? That was breakfast. You're in school all day, you forgot to bring a snack or lunch, you don't have money, so you didn't go to the cafeteria. You go home, dinner. All right? In between that time, blood glucose is doing what? Decreasing. That's going to signal the alpha cells of the pancreas to secrete glucagon. Glucagon is going to go to the liver. It's going to stimulate glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis. That's going to increase your blood sugar because your dumbass forgot to bring food in the interim. I'm not really calling you guys dumbasses. That's recorded. That increase in blood glucose is then going to go back to the alpha cells and shut off glucagon. Okay? Negative feedback. So that's what all this is saying. So if you forget that, it's all summarized right there. If you can't read that, this comes from your Guyton and Hall anatomy book in Clinical Key. All right, what happens when we have abnormal insulin secretion? Okay, abnormal insulin secretion. Typically, the problem is usually low insulin. Okay, typically the problem is low insulin. So that results in diabetes mellitus. Before we get into this, what's the difference between diabetes mellitus and what's the similarity between diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus? You pee a lot. What's the difference between those two? Pardon? Sugar in the pee versus no sugar in the pee. Right? Tastes sweet versus it tastes like nothing. Like pee. Ew. I'm reading this book right now. Audiobook. I go walking since I can't run anymore. I don't know if anybody's... I like sci-fi. If you don't know that by now, you really have not paid attention. It's called Helldivers. Anybody ever heard of this book series? Nobody? I thought somebody said yes. I was going to get excited. Let's talk. And it's based in the future. There was like World War III that destroyed the planet, so these people live in airships now. All right? And they send these helldivers, these guys that dive down to the surface. And they talk about how their suits work. So they wear these big suits that prevent them from getting irradiated and stuff. And there's filtration systems. So they're in these suits. They can't go to the bathroom. So you've got these filtration systems within them that allows them to recycle their urine, and they drink their own urine. as water because you got to prevent dehydration, right?
Sounds like food.
Do what?
Sounds like food.
Yeah, kind of. Anyway, that's not related to diabetes. It's related to drinking your own pee. Fake. I'm not going to argue. Two types of diabetes mellitus. You have type 1 and type 2. All right? Type 2 are going to be most of the patients you're going to see. Okay? Type 2 is related more to lifestyle than it is to an actual disease, a primary disease process. Okay? Type 1 is known as our insulin dependent. So that tells you how you treat it. How do you treat it?
Insulin.
You give insulin. Sweet. All right?